Hello and welcome to this exploration of one of the most consequential conflicts in ancient history, the Punic Wars. These were a series of 3 wars fought between Rome and Carthage from 264 to 146 BC that would ultimately determine which power would dominate the Western Mediterranean. As we'll see, these wars were absolutely massive in scale, stretching over more than a century and involving hundreds of thousands of soldiers. They also marked a crucial turning point, transforming Rome from a regional Italian power into a Mediterranean superpower. I find the Punic Wars utterly fascinating because they really showcase the brutal realities of ancient warfare and imperialism. We'll see daring invasions, cunning strategies, and acts of both incredible bravery and shocking brutality. By the end, one great civilization would be utterly destroyed, while another would be set on the path to creating one of the largest empires the world has ever seen. Now, before we dive into the wars themselves, it's important to understand the background of Rome and Carthage at this time. In the mid-3rd century BC, these were the 2 great powers of the Western Mediterranean, but with very different characters. Rome was a rising power that had recently unified the Italian peninsula under its control. It was a militaristic society with a powerful army, but at this point had little naval experience. Carthage, on the other hand, was an established maritime trading empire, descended from Phoenician colonists. It controlled territories across North Africa, southern Spain, and the major islands of the Western Mediterranean. Carthage was known for its wealth and its powerful navy, but its armies relied heavily on mercenaries rather than citizen soldiers. The First Punic War broke out in 264 BC, and the initial spark was a relatively minor dispute on Sicily. The city of Messana, modern Messina, had been taken over by a group of former mercenaries called the Mamertines. They appealed to both Rome and Carthage for protection against the Greek tyrant of Syracuse. Both powers responded, suddenly bringing them into conflict. Now, you might wonder why Rome would get involved in a dispute on Sicily when it had only just finished conquering Italy. Well, I think there were several factors at play. There was certainly an element of opportunism. Sicily was a wealthy island and an appealing target for expansion. But there was also likely a strategic calculation that if Rome didn't intervene, Carthage would gain full control of Sicily, putting it in a position to potentially threaten Italy. Whatever the exact motivations, Rome's intervention on Sicily quickly spiraled into a massive conflict. The Romans initially had success on land, defeating the Syracusans and forcing them into an alliance. They also besieged the main Carthaginian stronghold at Akragas, modern Agrigento, and defeated a Carthaginian relief force. But the Romans soon realized that to truly defeat Carthage, they would need to challenge its control of the seas. This led to one of the most remarkable developments of the war, Rome's crash program to build a navy from scratch. The Romans built copies that were heavier than the Carthaginian vessels, thus they were slower and less maneuverable. I find Rome's naval build-up absolutely fascinating. Imagine trying to become a naval power virtually overnight. The Romans took a captured Carthaginian ship as a model and set about mass-producing a fleet. To overcome their lack of naval experience, they equipped their ships with a device called the corvus, a kind of assault bridge that allowed them to turn sea battles into something more like land battles. It was an innovative solution, though not without its drawbacks. The corvus made the ships less seaworthy, and after some major losses to storms, the Romans eventually abandoned it. Nevertheless, Rome's naval program was a remarkable feat of organization and determination. Within a few years, they had a fleet capable of challenging Carthaginian naval supremacy. The First Punic War dragged on for 23 years, with numerous twists and turns. One of the most dramatic moments came in 256 BC, when the Romans launched a bold invasion of North Africa. They won a major naval victory at Cape Ecnomus, in what may have been the largest naval battle in ancient history, with hundreds of ships and over 150,000 men involved. The Roman army then landed in Africa and won several victories, to the point where Carthage sued for peace. But the Romans overplayed their hand, demanding such harsh terms that the Carthaginians chose to fight on. They hired a Spartan mercenary general named Xanthippus, who reorganized their army and inflicted a crushing defeat on the Romans. the Roman invasion force was almost entirely destroyed. At the Battle of Tunis in spring 255 BC, a combined force of infantry, cavalry, and war elephants under the command of the Spartan mercenary Xanthippus crushed the Romans. The war then shifted back to Sicily, where it became a grueling contest of sieges and small-scale engagements. Both sides suffered heavily, not just from battle but from storms that wrecked multiple fleets. The Romans besieged the last Carthaginian strongholds of Lilybaeum and Drepana, but struggled to make progress. In 249 BC, they suffered a major naval defeat at Drepana, losing almost an entire fleet. This was followed by another storm that wrecked a second fleet. At this point, the Romans largely abandoned naval operations for several years, while Carthage went on the offensive at sea. By the 240s BC, both sides were exhausted. Rome had suffered enormous casualties and was on the brink of bankruptcy. Carthage was struggling to pay its mercenaries. The war had reached a stalemate. But in 243 BC, the Romans made one final push. Private citizens funded the construction of a new fleet, and this force managed to cut off the Carthaginian garrisons on Sicily. In 241 BC, the Carthaginian fleet sailed to break the blockade, but was decisively defeated at the Battle of the Aegates Islands. This finally broke the deadlock. Carthage, unable to support its forces on Sicily, was forced to seek terms. The peace treaty that ended the First Punic War was harsh on Carthage. They had to evacuate Sicily, which became Rome's first overseas province. They also had to pay a massive indemnity. But perhaps most significantly, the myth of Carthaginian invincibility at sea had been shattered. Rome had emerged as a major naval power in its own right. The war had also strained Carthage's relationship with its mercenary armies, leading to a major revolt known as the Mercenary War immediately after the peace with Rome. This further weakened Carthage and allowed Rome to opportunistically seize Sardinia and Corsica, adding insult to injury. Polybius considered this contrary to all justice, and modern historians have variously described the Romans' behaviour as unprovoked aggression and treaty breaking, shamelessly opportunistic, and an unscrupulous act. In the aftermath of these setbacks, Carthage sought to recoup its losses by expanding its territory in Spain. This effort was led by the dynamic Barcid family, particularly Hamilcar Barca and his son-in-law Hasdrubal. They established a new power base in southern Spain, bringing its mineral wealth and manpower under Carthaginian control. Rome, wary of this expansion, concluded a treaty with Hasdrubal setting the Ebro River as the northern limit of Carthaginian influence in Spain. But this agreement would soon be tested by the actions of Hasdrubal's successor, the young, ambitious Hannibal Barca. Hannibal, who had sworn a childhood oath to always be an enemy of Rome, took command in Spain in 221 BC. He soon came into conflict with the city of Saguntum, which was allied with Rome but located south of the Ebro. In 219 BC, Hannibal besieged and captured Saguntum, brushing aside Roman diplomatic protests. The Romans, seeing this as a violation of their agreement with Carthage, demanded that Hannibal be handed over. When Carthage refused, Rome declared war, beginning the Second Punic War in 218 BC. This conflict would prove to be even larger and more dramatic than the first, and would be dominated by one of the most remarkable military campaigns in ancient history. Hannibal's plan for the Second Punic War was audacious to say the least. Rather than wait for the Romans to bring the fight to him in Spain or Africa, he decided to take the war directly to Italy. In one of the most famous military expeditions in history, Hannibal led an army of about 40,000 men and several dozen war elephants from Spain, through southern Gaul, and across the Alps into northern Italy. The crossing of the Alps was an incredible feat, undertaken in autumn when the passes were already becoming treacherous. Hannibal's army suffered heavily from the cold, difficult terrain and attacks by hostile mountain tribes. By the time he descended into Italy, his army had been reduced to about 26,000 men, and only a handful of elephants survived. But he had achieved the element of surprise, and his arrival sent shockwaves through Rome. Hannibal arrived with 20,000 infantry, 6,000 cavalry, and an unknown number of elephants, the survivors of the 37 with which he left Iberia, in what is now Piedmont, northern Italy, in early November. The Romans were still in their winter quarters. Hannibal's campaign in Italy was nothing short of brilliant. In a series of battles at the Trebbia River, Lake Trasimene, and most famously at Cannae, he inflicted crushing defeats on the Romans. His victory at Cannae in 216 BC was particularly devastating. Using sophisticated tactics, Hannibal enveloped and virtually annihilated a Roman army of over 80,000 men. It's estimated that perhaps 50,000 Romans were killed or captured in a single day, including 80 senators. This was one of the worst defeats in Roman history, and it seemed for a moment that Hannibal might have brought Rome to its knees. But here's where we see one of the most remarkable aspects of Roman society: their sheer determination and resilience. Despite these catastrophic defeats, Rome refused to surrender. They raised new armies, tapping into manpower reserves that included slaves and criminals. They adopted a strategy of avoiding pitched battles with Hannibal, instead focusing on wearing him down through attrition. Hannibal, for his part, found it difficult to turn his battlefield victories into strategic success. He lacked the resources to besiege Rome itself, and many of the Italian cities he hoped would defect to his cause remained loyal to Rome. As the war dragged on, Hannibal found himself increasingly isolated in southern Italy, while Rome gradually regained the initiative. By early 215 BC, they were fielding at least 12 legions, by 214 BC, 18, and by 213 BC, 22. By 212 BC, the full complement of the legions deployed would have been in excess of 100,000 men, plus, as always, a similar number of allied troops. While Hannibal was campaigning in Italy, the war was also being fought on other fronts. In Spain, the Romans gradually pushed back against Carthaginian control, despite some initial setbacks. The turning point came with the rise of Publius Cornelius Scipio, later known as Scipio Africanus. Scipio was a brilliant and innovative commander who revitalized the Roman war effort in Spain. In 209 BC, he captured the main Carthaginian base at New Carthage, modern Cartagena, in a daring assault. By 206 BC, he had driven the Carthaginians out of Spain entirely. Scipio then proposed a bold plan to invade Africa and threaten Carthage itself, just as Hannibal had invaded Italy. Despite opposition from more conservative elements in the Roman Senate, Scipio was given command of an expedition to Africa in 205 BC. He landed in 204 BC and quickly won a series of victories, aided by the defection of the Numidian cavalry leader Massinissa to the Roman side. Carthage was forced to recall Hannibal from Italy to defend the homeland. This set the stage for the final decisive battle of the war at Zama in 202 BC. Hannibal attempted to use 80 elephants to break into the Roman infantry formation, but the Romans countered them effectively and they routed back through the Carthaginian ranks. The Battle of Zama was a clash between two of the greatest generals of the ancient world, Hannibal and Scipio. Scipio used innovative tactics to neutralize Hannibal's war elephants and ultimately outmaneuvered the Carthaginian army. Hannibal was decisively defeated, and Carthage was forced to sue for peace. The terms were harsh. Carthage had to give up its empire, pay a massive indemnity, and agree not to wage war without Roman permission. The Second Punic War thus ended in total Roman victory, establishing Rome as the dominant power in the Western Mediterranean. In the decades following the Second Punic War, Carthage gradually recovered economically, but remained militarily weak and politically subordinate to Rome. However, there was a faction in Rome, led by Cato the Elder, that believed Carthage would always be a threat as long as it existed. Cato would famously end all his speeches in the Senate, regardless of the topic, with the phrase, "Carthage must be destroyed." In 149 BC, Rome used a border dispute between Carthage and Numidia as a pretext to declare war, beginning the Third Punic War. In 151 BC, Carthage raised an army, the treaty notwithstanding, and counterattacked the Numidians. The campaign ended in disaster for the Carthaginians, and their army surrendered. This war was really more of a siege than a war. The Romans demanded that the Carthaginians abandon their city and move inland. When they refused, the Romans laid siege to Carthage. The siege lasted 3 years, with the Carthaginians putting up a determined resistance. But in 146 BC, the Romans finally broke through. What followed was one of the most infamous episodes in ancient history. The Romans systematically destroyed Carthage, killing or enslaving its population. The city was burned, and according to some accounts, the ground was sown with salt to symbolize its total destruction. The destruction of Carthage marked the end of the Punic Wars and eliminated Rome's last major rival in the Western Mediterranean. The former Carthaginian territories were annexed as the Roman province of Africa. This event is often seen as a turning point in Roman history, marking Rome's transformation into an uncontested imperial power. It's worth noting, however, that the story of Rome salting the earth of Carthage is likely a later invention. There's no contemporary evidence for it, and it would have been counterproductive for the Romans to render fertile African land useless. There is a tradition that Roman forces then sowed the city with salt, but this has been shown to have been a 19th century invention. In conclusion, the Punic Wars were a titanic struggle that shaped the ancient Mediterranean world. They transformed Rome from a regional power into an empire, and led to the destruction of one of the great civilizations of the ancient world. The legacy of these wars would be felt for centuries, influencing the development of Roman imperialism and military strategy. The figure of Hannibal, in particular, would long haunt the Roman imagination as the ultimate enemy. These wars remind us of the brutal realities of ancient warfare and the high stakes of imperial competition. They also showcase both the remarkable resilience of Roman society and its capacity for ruthlessness in pursuit of power. Thanks for watching this video on the Punic Wars. If you enjoyed it, please consider liking and subscribing to the channel. Your support really does make a difference. And do let me know in the comments if there are other aspects of ancient history you'd like to see covered in future videos.